My name is Audrey, and 3 days after my grandmother's funeral, my brother Vance threw my 7-year-old son's snowboard off the deck into a snowbank and locked the deadbolt on our family's Aspen cabin. As his wife Lisa sipped her espresso behind the frosted glass of the living room window, Vance looked at me and said, "This mountain belongs to men, Audrey. Girls are just guests." He thought locking me out in the freezing cold meant he had won, completely unaware that the heavy leather bag hanging from my shoulder held a certified financial statement that was about to cost him his entire fake empire. Welcome back to 1989 Revenge Stories, the channel where quiet people finally get the last word and the paperwork does the shouting. If you have ever been treated like a visitor in your own family, the one whose hard work was completely ignored while someone else took all the credit, this story is for you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of justice. Now let me take you back to Aspen, Colorado. Altitude 8,000 feet, where the air is painfully thin and the family money is usually generations thick. My grandmother, Eleanor, built the Pine Ridge Lodge in the late 70s. It sits on 500 acres of pristine, unlogged pine forest, a piece of land so beautiful and rare that developers have been trying to get their hands on it for 3 decades. Growing up, the division of labor and respect in our family was simple. Vance was 6 years older, the golden boy, the firstborn son. He was given private ski instructors, management courses, and a seat at the table with the resort investors. I was given instructions on how to fold the linen napkins in the dining hall and told to make sure the hot cocoa station was fully stocked. My grandfather, before he passed, had a phrase he repeated like it was a law of physics. Every holiday, every time the future of the lodge came up, he would clap Vance on the shoulder and say, "The mountain belongs to men. Girls are just guests." He said it the way you would say snow is cold, not with malice, just absolute certainty. Vance would grin, soaking up the inheritance he hadn't worked for. I would stare at the floorboards and say nothing. When I turned 18, I packed a single duffel bag to leave for college. My grandmother met me by the front door. She didn't hug me, she wasn't the hugging type, but she pressed a heavy, antique brass compass and a silver rescue whistle into my palm. "The mountain doesn't care if you're a boy or a girl, Audrey," she told me quietly. "It only cares if you can survive the cold. Go find your own true north." So I did. I left Aspen and went to Denver. I put myself through business school, and then I built a logistics and supply chain company from the ground up. I spent my 20s waking up at 4 in the morning to handle frozen freight trucks, delayed shipments, union negotiations, and the brutal, unglamorous reality of moving heavy things across the country. I was good at it, really good. By the time I was 30, I had 60 employees. By 34, my company was moving national accounts. My net worth quietly crossed $9 million last year. But my family thought I was just a mid-level office manager, barely scraping by as a single mother. I drove a sensible Subaru because it handled the snow, and I didn't wear designer brands because my job required steel-toed boots more often than heels. Nobody in Aspen ever asked me about my business. When I visited, Vance would talk loudly about his VIP clients, his luxury SUV leases, and his plans to elevate the lodge. If I mentioned securing a massive logistics contract, Vance would just nod patronizingly and ask if my little shipping job was giving me good health insurance. I stopped bringing it up. I kept my grandmother's compass in my bag, a quiet reminder of what survival actually looked like. Grandma Eleanor died of a sudden stroke 14 months ago. I got the call in the middle of a board meeting and drove straight up the mountain, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. When I arrived at the lodge, Vance was already playing the tragic, burdened heir. He was wearing a cashmere sweater, shaking hands with wealthy neighbors, acting like he had been running the entire mountain by himself. Lisa was posting black and white photos of the lodge on Instagram with the hashtag legacy. Meanwhile, I handled the funeral home, the death certificates, the catering for the wake, and the agonizing task of packing away my grandmother's clothes. I took the jobs nobody else wanted because I was used to carrying the heavy things. At the reception, while Vance was giving a tearful, empty toast about carrying the family torch, a man in a dark suit appeared beside me near the coat rack. It was Mr. Caldwell, my grandmother's estate attorney. He was 70 years old, sharp as cracked ice, and wasted no words. "Stay in town," he said quietly, not looking at me directly. "Eleanor made changes to the will after she saw the state of Vance's finances. You will want to hear them, both of you together." 6 days later, Vance decided he was done waiting. I was in the kitchen of the cabin making oatmeal for my son, Leo. Vance walked in with his heavy snow boots, tracking slush across the hardwood floor. "I need you out by noon," he said. No greeting, just an eviction notice delivered over breakfast. "Probate is just a formality. The mountain stays with the men. You know the rule. I need the space, so Lisa and I can start the renovations." I told him I wasn't leaving until the lawyer read the will. That was when he grabbed Leo's snowboard by the door, marched out to the deck, and threw it into the snow. He turned to me, his eyes full of the arrogant entitlement he had been fed his entire life. "Hope you enjoy the drive down, Audrey," he said coldly. "I made sure you get nothing." Then he shut the heavy oak door in my face and turned the deadbolt. I stood on the frozen deck, holding my son's hand. I didn't bang on the glass. I didn't cry. I watched Lisa sip her espresso inside the warm cabin, looking at me like I was a stray dog that had finally been chased off the porch. I picked up Leo's snowboard from the snowbank, loaded our bags into the back of my Subaru, and drove us down the mountain to a cheap $70 a night motel in town. I sat on the edge of the stiff motel bed that night, listening to the wind rattle the window. I could have driven back to Denver. I could have let Vance keep his crumbling kingdom. But Mr. Caldwell had told me to stay, and my grandmother had given me a compass for a reason. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. It was time to call my CFO and get the paperwork ready. The mountain was about to experience an avalanche, and my brother was standing right in the drop zone. The Alpine Crest Motel smelled of old carpets and industrial lavender cleaner, a brutal contrast to the cedar and pine warmth of my grandmother's lodge. I set up my laptop on the laminate desk, made a pot of terrible in-room coffee, and went back to being Audrey Vail, CEO and founder of a logistics empire that moved $14 million in freight last fiscal year. Leo was asleep on the neighboring double bed, holding his damp snowboard jacket like a security blanket, while I quietly reviewed a shipping network audit for a major medical supplier in Denver. Numbers had always been my sanctuary. They didn't have a favorite child. They didn't care if you were a son or a daughter. They just stood there, cold and naked, telling you exactly what was true. At noon, my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, showed up unannounced with a plastic container of chicken soup and an agenda. She sat on the edge of the polyester comforter, looking at the cramped room with an expression that tried very hard to look sympathetic but only managed to look patronizing. "I heard what happened at the cabin, Audrey," she said, smoothing her fleece vest. "Vance can be hot-headed, but you need to understand his position. This is how it has always been in Aspen. The men keep the mountain, the girls marry out and build lives elsewhere. Fighting him will only tear the family name apart in front of the whole town." "I am not married, Carol," I said, my voice flat as I stared at my laptop screen. "And my son is sleeping in a $70 motel because my brother threw his things into a snowbank. And that's unfortunate, it really is," Carol sighed, leaning forward. "But survival means knowing your place, honey. I gave up my share of your grandfather's land in Utah 40 years ago because it was expected of me. I let my brothers have it, and I survived. You will too." She said it like survival was a trophy, like a woman's highest achievement should be enduring a theft with quiet grace. I looked at her sallow face and realized Carol wasn't just defending the family tradition. She was its oldest casualty. She had allowed them to erase her, and now she needed me to be erased too, just so she wouldn't feel so alone in her regret. I thanked her for the soup, declined her advice, and let her leave. 2 days before the formal reading of the will, I drove past the main gates of Pine Ridge Lodge to check on the lower equipment sheds. That was when I saw a sedan with a commercial bank logo parked in the driveway. A man in a sharp gray suit was standing on the porch, holding a clipboard, and Vance was talking to him through the half-open door. Vance's voice didn't have its usual booming structural majesty. It was high, defensive, and ragged at the edges. "The estate probate clears next week," Vance was pleading, his hands gesturing frantically. "Once the title transfers, I'm liquidating the back timber rights. Your bank will get its full payout. Just give me 10 days.
Mr. Vail, this is the final notice of default on your personal line of credit and the secondary mortgage on your Aspen townhome," the banker replied, his voice clean and merciless. "If the balance isn't settled, the foreclosure proceedings will initiate automatically." Vance saw my Subaru idling at the curb, his face instantly contorted from sheer panic into a mask of absolute fury. He slammed the heavy cabin door shut, and the banker retreated to his sedan without another word. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just shifted into drive and moved down the mountain. A man who borrows against his foundation is a man standing on a trap door, my father used to say. I had always assumed he was talking about business, but watching Vance sweat on that porch, I realized my grandmother had seen the trapdoor opening beneath her golden grandson long before he did. The night before the reading, the motel room was completely still except for the low hum of the mini fridge. I sat on the edge of the bed and unlatched the velvet-lined box that held my grandmother's antique brass compass. I turned the heavy metal instrument over in my hands, feeling the cold weight of it. That was when I noticed a slight seam along the inside lining of the cedar box itself. I used the edge of my fingernail to pry up the false bottom. Tucked flat against the wood underneath were 2 documents and a handwritten note. The first document was a certified default notice from a private lending firm in New York, detailing a $2 million personal loan Vance had taken out 2 years ago, using his projected inheritance of the lodge as a guarantee. The second was a formal appraisal of the 500 acres of pristine pine forest behind the property, the Pine Ridge Tract. It was completely unencumbered, debt-free, and valued at $11 million. On the scrap of notebook paper, my grandmother's cramped, elegant handwriting held only 7 words. Audrey, ask Caldwell about the back acres. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Caldwell's private line. It was 11:15 at night, but he answered on the second ring, his voice as dry and alert as chalk dust. "You found the false bottom," Caldwell stated. It wasn't a question. "He's in default, Mr. Caldwell," I said, holding the paper under the weak, yellow light of the motel lamp. "Vance mortgaged his entire life before Grandma even passed away." "He did," Caldwell confirmed smoothly. "He overextended on a luxury ski rental venture in Vail that collapsed during the pandemic. He owes millions to private creditors who are prepared to seize any asset he inherits. Your grandmother knew that if she left the land to him outright, the trees would be clear-cut by developers within a month to pay his debts. So she instituted a dead hand control clause." "What kind of clause?" "A conditional bequest," Caldwell explained. "The 500 acres of the Pine Ridge Tract will not pass through the standard lineage. The will requires both children to submit a certified, independent CPA financial statement at the time of the reading. The land will be awarded exclusively to whichever child can demonstrate the liquid capacity to hold that forest completely debt-free without leveraging or mortgaging it for a minimum of 10 years. I looked down at the brass compass resting on my knee. "Vance filed his statement this afternoon," Caldwell continued, a faint, rare trace of amusement entering his dry voice. "He thinks his confidence is a legal tender. Have your partner send over your certified corporate portfolio before 9 tomorrow morning, Audrey. Let's see what the math says." I hung up, dialed my CFO in Denver, and gave the order. The avalanche was officially moving. Mr. Caldwell's conference room smelled of old leather and lemon polish, a quiet sanctuary of wood and law that had remained unchanged since my grandfather sat in these same burgundy chairs 40 years ago. A massive walnut table, built by local craftsmen decades ago, dominated the center of the room. 2 sealed manila folders rested precisely at the head of the table where Mr. Caldwell was about to sit. Vance arrived first. He practically marched into the room wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his luxury Swiss watch catching the sharp morning light cutting through the blinds. He pulled out the heavy leather chair at the center of the table and sat down with the relaxed, expansive posture of a man about to receive a coronation. Lisa followed closely behind him, her eyes glued to her phone, already radiating the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she owned the mountain. Aunt Carol sat at the far end of the table, clutching her purse strap, looking nervous. I took the chair directly across from my brother. I had left Leo with a trusted sitter at the motel. He didn't need to see the wreckage that was about to occur in this room. Vance looked across the table at me, his eyes running over my plain knit sweater and lack of designer jewelry. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face. "I'm surprised you showed up, Audrey," he said, his voice dripping with casual arrogance. "I thought you'd be halfway back to Denver by now. There's no shame in admitting when a game is over." I didn't answer. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edge of my grandmother's antique brass compass, and waited. Mr. Caldwell entered the room, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a solid, echoing click. He didn't engage in small talk. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, sat at the head of the table, and opened the first manila folder. "We will begin with the standard distribution of Eleanor Vale's estate," Caldwell announced, his dry voice cutting through the tension like a razor. He read through the technical legal descriptions of the property, the liquidation of minor bank accounts, and the funeral expenses in a flat, measured drone. Then, he reached the primary homestead allocation. "To my grandson, Vance Thomas Vale," Caldwell read, "I leave the residential structure known as Pine Ridge Lodge, including all auxiliary buildings, equipment sheds, and the immediate parcel of land comprising the main homestead." Vance leaned back in his chair. He didn't yell or cheer. He did something worse. He nodded slowly, closing his eyes in a gesture of absolute triumph. He turned his head slightly toward me, his voice a low, venomous purr. "The mountain belongs to the men, Audrey. Dad said it. Grandfather said it. You should have stayed in the valley." Lisa let out a soft, sharp laugh, her manicured fingers tapping rapidly on her phone screen, likely draft messaging her interior designer. "Mr. Vale?" Caldwell interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a sudden heavy stillness that froze the room. "We are not finished." Vance frowned, his posture tightening. "What do you mean? The lodge is the estate. It's done." "It is not done," Caldwell said, closing the first folder with a definitive thud and laying his hand flat on the second, heavier folder. "Your grandmother's will contains a final, conditional codicil regarding the unencumbered back acres, the 500 acres of the Pine Ridge Tract Forest. It is a conditional bequest subject to dead hand control." The smile vanished from Vance's face. Lisa's thumb stopped moving over her phone screen. Caldwell pulled a crisp sheet of cream paper from the folder and cleared his throat. "I will read Eleanor's exact words. I have spent my life watching the assets of this family be leveraged, mortgaged, and treated like playthings by those who value appearance over substance. I will not watch this forest be clear-cut to pay for a lifestyle that was never earned. Therefore, I direct that the 500 acres of the Pine Ridge Tract shall pass exclusively to whichever of my children can demonstrate the absolute financial capacity to hold this land debt-free, without mortgage, lien, or encumbrance, for a minimum period of 10 years. Whichever child cannot meet this standard shall receive nothing from this tract." Caldwell looked up over his glasses. Both beneficiaries were required to submit an independent, certified CPA financial statement by 9 o'clock this morning. I have reviewed them. Vance's jaw locked. He aggressively slammed both hands flat on the walnut table. "This is absurd! I run the lodge. The land is legally tied to my position as the firstborn son. A piece of paper doesn't change 30 years of family tradition." "The law cares about signatures, Mr. Vale, not traditions," Caldwell replied coldly. He picked up the first sealed envelope, slicing it open with a silver letter opener. "Vance Thomas Vale. Verified financial statement prepared by Henderson Accounting. Total assets listed: 1 Aspen townhome, valued at $1.2 million. Personal accounts, $14,000. Caldwell paused, looking directly at Vance. "Total liabilities: a secondary mortgage on the townhome of $400,000, an outstanding defaulted private commercial loan of $2 million. Total net worth, negative $1,286,000. Your accounts are insolvent, Mr. Vale. You do not possess the financial capacity to hold a single acre of that land debt-free. Under the terms of the condition, your claim is disqualified." The silence that followed was suffocating. The numbers sat in the room like a physical weight. Vance's face went entirely white, a thin line of sweat appearing at his temple. Aunt Carol gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. "Now," Caldwell continued, picking up the second envelope, "Brooke Audrey Vale. Verified financial statement prepared by Kowalski and Associates, Independent CPAs, Denver." He slipped the document out, his eyes scanning the front page. Total assets? Equity stake in Vale Logistics Group post-sale, $4.5 million. Diversified market index holdings, $3.2 million. Commercial real estate assets in Denver metropolitan area, $1.4 million. Cash and liquid reserves, $400,000. Total liabilities, 0. No mortgages, no liens, no outstanding debt of any kind. Caldwell laid the paper down on the table, smoothing it with his palm. Total certified net worth, $9,500,000. The number hit the room like a detonation. Vance stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his eyes bulging with a wild, terrifying mix of shock, confusion, and raw fear. He looked at the paper, then at me, then at the numbers that completely erased his entire existence. The simple, merciless arithmetic proved that the sister he had spent his life dismissing as a charity case was a multi-millionaire, while his entire lifestyle was a hollow shell built on borrowed money. $9 million? Vance whispered, his voice cracking hoarsely. Lisa made a strange, strangled sound in her throat, her phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the carpet. "By the explicit terms of your grandmother's conditional bequest," Caldwell declared, looking at me with a profound, unshakable respect, "Audrey Vale is the sole qualifying beneficiary. The 500 acres of the Pine Ridge tract pass entirely and immediately to her." Vance gripped the edges of the table, his fingers spreading wide, as if he were trying to prevent the room from spinning. His breathing became shallow, rapid, and entirely wrong. $5 million, he muttered again, his eyes rolling back into his head. A second later, his knees completely gave out. He slid sideways out of his chair, his shoulder hitting the edge of the mahogany table heavily as he collapsed onto the hardwood floor. On his way down, his arm caught a tall glass of water, toppling it. The water began pooling across the polished walnut surface, soaking into the edges of the legal folders like a slow, deliberate tide. Lisa screamed, a short, piercing sound of pure panic, and lunged toward the floor. Aunt Carol knocked her chair over backward as she stood up, coins spilling from her unzipped purse and scattering across the floor. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't move from my chair. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile, and I didn't say a single word. I watched my brother lie unconscious on the floor of a lawyer's office, undone entirely by the merciless truth of a spreadsheet. I simply reached into my bag, wrapped my fingers around my grandmother's brass compass, and felt the quiet, cold weight of my true north. The paramedics arrived in under 10 minutes. By then, Vance was sitting upright in a leather chair, holding a cold compress to his forehead. Lisa was hovering beside him, frantically texting on her phone, likely consulting a divorce attorney or doing damage control with her country club friends. The EMTs checked his blood pressure, shined a penlight into his eyes, and strongly recommended he go to the hospital for observation. He refused the transport, of course. Men who believe they own the mountain do not ride in ambulances. When the paramedics finally packed up their equipment and left the conference room, the silence that settled over the mahogany table was entirely different from the one before. It was the heavy, exhausted silence of a collapsed building. Vance looked across the table at me. The arrogant, booming patriarch I had known my entire life was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified man whose fake empire had just been repossessed by reality. "You knew," Vance whispered, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of betrayal and self-pity. "You sat there with your little secret and let me look like a complete fool in front of everyone." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no triumph. Just the clean, cold clarity of a winter morning. "I didn't make you look like anything, Vance," I said evenly, packing my grandmother's brass compass back into my leather bag. I didn't take out those loans. I didn't mortgage your inheritance. I just built my own life. You are the one who chose to lock a 7-year-old boy out in the snow because you thought you held all the keys." His jaw clenched. "I stayed!" he shouted, his voice cracking as he slammed a fist against the armrest. "I stayed here and managed the lodge. I dealt with the investors. I did everything this family asked of me. And now the bank is going to take my home, and you get to walk away with 500 acres of prime real estate just because you hoarded your money?" "She isn't walking away with it because she hoarded it, Vance." The voice didn't come from me. It came from the end of the table. Aunt Carol was still standing by the wall, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Tears were streaming quietly down her weathered face, settling into the deep lines around her mouth. "She is walking away with it because she earned the right to hold it," Carol said, her voice thin but remarkably steady. She looked at Vance, then turned to me. "I gave up my share of your grandfather's land 40 years ago because they told me the mountain belonged to the men. I handed over my birthright, and it ate my entire life, Audrey. It ate my confidence, my independence, and my voice." Carol wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, standing taller than I had ever seen her. "Your grandmother was right to stop the cycle, and I was wrong to tell you to accept it. I am so sorry." I believed her. But I also knew that an apology, no matter how sincere, doesn't rewrite history. It only allows you to finally step out of it. 3 months later, the private creditors initiated foreclosure proceedings on Pine Ridge Lodge and Vance's luxury townhome. The secondary mortgages and the defaulted commercial loans completely consumed whatever equity the estate had left him. The bank seized the properties just before the first heavy snowfall of November. Lisa moved out 3 weeks before the sheriff's sale, taking her designer bags and moving back to her parents' estate in California. She filed for divorce shortly after. Vance attempted to contest my grandmother's conditional bequest in probate court, arguing that the dead hand control clause was unreasonable. Mr. Caldwell responded with an airtight 60-page brief on Colorado estate law, attaching my certified financial statements and Vance's default notices. The judge dismissed Vance's motion in exactly 9 days, ruling that the testator's conditions were clear, lawful, and absolute. I didn't buy the lodge at the bank auction. I let it go. It was a monument to a family hierarchy that had never wanted me, built on rules I refused to pass down to my son. But the trees, the 500 acres of ancient, unlogged pine forest standing silent and majestic behind the property, that land was mine. In late January, I drove Leo up the mountain. The air was painfully crisp, the sky a brilliant, blinding blue, and the snow crunched heavily under our boots. We walked past the property line of the old lodge, stepping into the deep, untouched quiet of the Pine Ridge tract. Leo ran ahead, his red winter coat a bright flash against the white snow, laughing as his boots sank into the powder. I stood still, taking a deep breath of the freezing air. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my grandmother's heavy brass compass. The needle trembled for a moment before locking firmly in place, pointing straight toward the heart of the forest. "The mountain belongs to men," my grandfather used to say. "Girls are just guests." He was wrong. The mountain doesn't care about your gender, your birth order, or how loudly you demand respect in a crowded room. The mountain only belongs to the people who are strong enough to weather the cold, carry their own weight, and navigate the storms without asking someone else to pull them through. I slipped the compass back into my pocket and walked toward my son. We were going to build a new cabin here, a smaller one built on solid ground, funded by money that I had earned with my own 2 hands. A place where the doors would never be locked to keep family out, and where the word worth would never be measured by a name, but by the integrity of the person carrying it. That is my story, a frozen deck, a hidden spreadsheet, and a brother who learned too late that pride is a terrible source of heat. If you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, if you have ever been told that your hard work doesn't count, or if you have ever had to quietly build your own empire while people who underestimated you played king in a crumbling castle, I want to hear from you. How did you finally walk away and claim your own true north? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Because if you are still out there in the cold, doubting your own value, I promise you this: your compass works. You just have to trust it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.